So to start off today's deep dive, I want you to just imagine a really stark, beautifully designed visual right in front of you.
Hmm.
Just a pristine white background. And on the left side of this image, there is a very crisp green leaf icon.
Right, like the universal symbol for eco-friendly.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
represents a nation that has achieved, well, what a lot of industrialized countries spend billions trying to figure out. Over the last decade, this nation has slashed its carbon emissions per capita by over 70%.
Wow, that's massive.
Yeah. And its material footprint, the sheer volume of raw physical resources it extracts and consumes from the earth, that has absolutely plummeted too.
So on paper, it looks incredible.
Right. If you were looking strictly at planetary pressures, focusing just on that pure, isolated data of environmental impact, it looks like an absolute green utopia.
I mean, it sounds like the ultimate success story, right? A society living in perfect harmony with its ecological limits.
It really does. But then you look at the right side of this visual. Next to that green leaf is a jagged black line graph that doesn't just trend downward. It looks like a structural collapse.
Yeah, a complete free fall.
Because here's the gut punch.
Hmm.
This is not a climate success story. We are not talking about some Scandinavian nation pioneering a new green tech revolution. We are talking about Yemen.
Which completely flips the narrative.
It really does.
Yeah.
And this paradox, this illusion of a, green milestone that's actually masking a total systemic breakdown, that is the mission of our deep dive today.
Yeah, and to do this, we are looking at a deeply comprehensive 15-part data narrative. It's built entirely from United Nations Development Program datasets.
Right, the UNDP.
Exactly. And these datasets span from 1990 all the way to 2023. We're going to deconstruct this so-called green illusion and explore how systemic conflict and structural inequality don't just hit the pause button on a country's development.
Right, they do so much worse.
They actively fold it in on itself. They create this developmental black hole where the numbers can tell a profoundly deceptive story if you aren't looking at the actual human mechanics beneath them.
Yeah, and just a brief note to you, the listener, before we really immerse ourselves in these numbers. The data sets we are unpacking today, they document the extreme outcomes of political conflict, institutional collapse, and war.
Hmm.
But as always, this deep dive will remain entirely impartial. We aren't here to take political sides or, assign blame to specific factions.
Right, no geopolitical debates here.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Our focus is exclusively on the human data. We're here to understand the mechanics of how a society's statistical foundation unravels and what actually happens to the human beings caught inside that unraveling.
And to really understand that unraveling, we have to start by taking a magnifying glass to that environmental paradox you introduced.
Yeah, the green leaf versus the collapsing line.
Exactly. It introduces this highly specific UN metric called the PHDI, which stands for the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
Okay, the PHDI. Let's really break down what that means, because this is where the whole optical illusion of the data really begins. Because the traditional Human Development Index, the HDI, it measures the things we all intuitively associate with progress, right? Like life expectancy, years of schooling, standard of living.
Right. But for decades, climatologists and environmental scientists pointed out a major flaw in that traditional HDI.
Which is what?
Well, countries with the highest human development scores, places with great hospitals, universal education, high incomes, they were achieving those living standards by aggressively extracting resources.
Oh, I see. By pumping massive amounts of carbon in the atmosphere.
Exactly. The human progress was coming at the direct expense of the planet's future.
So the UN introduced the PHDI as like a corrective lens, takes that standard human development score and mathematically penalizes a country for high carbon emissions and high material consumption.
Right. It's an attempt to measure true sustainable progress. But when you apply this exact formula to Yemen, the numbers create a terrifying false positive.
A false positive, because the environmental impact is low, but for all the wrong reasons.
Exactly. Because Yemen's economic and industrial infrastructure has experienced a near total collapse, their carbon footprint dropped to a staggering 0.29 tons per capita in 2023.
Wait, 0.29 tons?
Yeah.
If we think about the global average, which was that hover around like 4.5 tons per capita, depending on the year.
Yeah, right on there.
So Yemen is producing a tiny fraction of the global norm.
And furthermore, their material footprint, which measures the literal physical biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, all of that extracted to meet consumption, That dropped to just 1.62 tons per capita.
Wow.
So when the UN formula plugs in these incredibly low environmental impact numbers, the mathematical adjustment actually makes Yemen look sustainable.
But the mechanism driving this sustainability is just pure tragedy. I mean, claiming this drop in emissions is a green victory. It's like congratulating a patient on their rapid weight loss when the underlying reality is that they are literally starving to death.
That is a perfect analogy, yes.
The emissions didn't drop because they built wind farms or, transitioned to electric public transit. The emissions dropped because the power plants were destroyed.
The factories stopped running.
Right. The supply chains evaporated. The environment isn't being actively protected. Human industrial activity has simply been forcibly paralyzed.
And that paralysis really forces us to ask a critical question about how we interpret global data. If we celebrate a drop in planetary pressure in a vacuum, without looking at the human context, we are entirely missing the reality on the ground.
So to see that reality, we have to strip away the planetary pressure adjustment entirely. We have to look purely at the raw Human Development Index.
The standard HDI.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And tracing the HDI from 1990 to 2023, it's like looking at the heartbeat of a nation on a monitor.
Yeah.
And the shape of this line tells the story of an entirely lost generation.
It really does.
Let's go back to 1990. Where does this baseline even begin?
So in 1990, Yemen's HDI was 0.359. And to provide context, the HDI is measured on a scale from 0 to 1. A score of 0.359 is exceptionally low.
Right, placing the country near the absolute bottom of global rankings at the time.
Exactly. It indicates a society struggling with high mortality, low literacy, and severe poverty.
But from that very low point in 1990, the trajectory actually changes. If you look at the chart, you see this incredibly slow, grueling, incremental climb.
Yeah, it is the literal visualization of nation building. Over 24 years, you can see the effort of an entire society working to pull itself upward.
Because moving the HDI is notoriously difficult, isn't it?
It is an enormous, slow-moving aggregate. You can't just change a single policy and watch the HDI spike.
Right, it takes real physical infrastructure.
Exactly. To move the HDI up by even a few hundredths of a point, you have to build physical schools, you have to staff them with teachers.
You have to pave roads so pregnant women can actually reach a medical clinic.
Yes, you have to expand local markets so people can actually increase their daily income.
It requires millions of small, localized victories happening simultaneously over decades. And by 2014, those victories had actually added up.
They had. Yemen had clawed its way to a peak HDI of 0.502. They'd finally crossed that crucial halfway mark.
And that 0.502 represented hard-fought, generational progress. People were living slightly longer. More children, particularly girls, were sitting in classrooms.
The baseline of human dignity was expanding.
Right. But then we hit the 2014-2015 timeline. This is the moment systemic conflict entirely consumes the nation. And the data doesn't just dip.
No, it's a sheer cliff.
I'm looking at the trajectory here, and it's not a recession. It's not a temporary setback. It's like watching a high-rise building where the foundation, the load-bearing walls, and the roof all just give out at the exact same millisecond.
That's exactly what it looks like on the graph.
From that peak of 0.502 in 2014, the HDI plummets to 0.470 by 2023. Now, to someone not steeped in UN statistics, a drop from 0.502 to 0.470, well, it might just sound like a few decimal points.
Right, it might sound like a minor fluctuation on a spreadsheet.
But it's not.
It is anything but minor. In the realm of demographic statistics, a drop of over 30 thousandths of a point in less than a decade is catastrophic.
Because, as we discussed, the HDI is a massive aggregate of millions of lives.
Right. For the average to fall that rapidly, it means every single pillar of society is collapsing at the exact same time. The schools are emptying, the hospitals are running out of basic antibiotics and just shutting their doors.
And the local economies are entirely freezing up.
Exactly. It effectively means that 2 decades of that slow, grueling climb were erased in just a few years. By 2023, Yemen had time-traveled backward to a developmental state it hadn't seen since the early 2000s.
An entire generation's worth of progress just completely wiped off the board.
And the isolation of this collapse becomes glaringly apparent when you plot the global average HDI on the exact same timeline.
Right, let's look at the global context.
Throughout this same period, the global average line is a smooth, relentless curve upward, even accounting for global recessions, regional conflicts elsewhere, and, a massive global pandemic.
The world kept moving.
Yes. Humanity as a whole continued to push its development forward, reaching an average HDI of 0.756 by 2023.
So you have the global line marching steadily up toward point 0.8, and the Yemen line violently breaking away from it in 2014, plunging down toward point 0.4.
Mm-hmm.
Yemen wasn't just experiencing a domestic crisis, it was being utterly decoupled from the trajectory of the modern world. Humanity moved forward, and this nation was locked into a downward spiral.
Completely severed from global progress, which brings us to a really crucial pivot in our understanding here.
Okay, what's the pivot?
Well, a macro collapse in an index like the HDI can feel very abstract. It's just a formula. But that formula is driven by literal physical realities on the ground.
Right.
If we want to understand how a country's development falls off a cliff, we have to look at the first domino to fall, the economic free fall.
We have to look at what happens to the wallets, the dinner tables, and the daily survival mechanisms of the population. And think about your own local community, right? If the local economy shrinks by 5 or 10%, that's a major recession. Businesses board up their windows, people lose their homes, and the social safety net is strained to the breaking point.
Absolutely.
But the data we are looking at here isn't a recession. It is the outright evaporation of national wealth on a scale that just defies standard economics.
We measure this through a metric called gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
Okay.
And to make sure we are looking at real, tangible value rather than just inflated currency, we measure this in 2021 purchasing power parity dollars.
Let's clarify. Purchasing power parity, or PPP, really quickly for the listener because it's vital here.
Right.
We aren't just looking at exchange rates, because during a conflict, a local currency can become basically worthless paper.
Exactly.
So PPP looks at what a unit of currency can actually buy at the market today. It measures real-world survival capacity, how much flour, fuel, or medicine a person can actually procure.
Precisely. And in 2010, before the crisis reached its tipping point, Yemen's GNI per capita had reached $3,707.
Okay.
Now, in the grand scheme of global wealth, $3,707 a year is still quite low, but it represents a functioning economy. People were earning wages, goods were crossing borders. There's a recognizable system of commerce.
So $3,707 in 2010.
By 2023, that number had plunged to just $1,018.
Wait, think about that math. Going from $3,700 down to roughly $1,000. That is a 72.5% reduction in national wealth.
Yes.
Imagine waking up tomorrow and 72% of the money in your bank account is permanently gone. But it's not just your account. It's the grocery store's operating budget.
It's the local hospital's purchasing power for surgical supplies.
It's the municipal government's ability to pay the people who keep the water running.
7 out of every $10 of wealth in the entire country simply cease to exist.
That is just, it's unimaginable.
When an economy contracts by 72.5%, the formal economy effectively dies. The central banking system cannot function. Large-scale employers just vanish.
So what do people actually do on the ground?
What happens is that people are forced to revert to informal economies, extreme subsistence living, and bartering just to secure the next meal.
And while this total financial void is swallowing the country, the global average GNI per capita surpassed $20,000.
Right.
The gap between an average Yemeni citizen and an average global citizen isn't just widening, it has become a literal chasm of alternate reality.
And when wealth evaporates that violently, our entire definition of the word poverty actually has to shift.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in developed nations, we often equate poverty with a low income, a lack of cash. But in a collapsed state, poverty isn't just a lack of cash, it is a fundamental deprivation of human existence.
And the UN has a specific tool to measure this multidimensional aspect, right? The Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI.
Yes, the MPI is a brilliant, albeit totally devastating, analytical tool because it looks beyond the wallet. It measures acute deprivations in health, education, and living standards that a person faces simultaneously. According to the data, the MPI poverty headcount in Yemen sits at 37.4%. That means well over a third of the entire population is living in acute multidimensional poverty.
But the truly revealing part of this data isn't just that top-line 37.4% figure, is it?
No, it's not.
It's the breakdown of what is actually driving that poverty. If we visualize this data-like picture, a massive tree map in front of you, a visual breakdown of the core components dragging people into this poverty income isn't the biggest block on that screen.
Not at all. When we isolate the specific drivers contributing to that 37.4% poverty rate, the largest single contributor is malnutrition.
Wow.
It accounts for an astounding 24.6% of the entire multidimensional poverty index.
So nearly a quarter of the poverty in the country is defined not by debt or a lack of wages, but by the literal biological lack of caloric intake.
Exactly. It is the physical wasting away of the population.
And what's the second largest block on that tree map?
The second largest contributor, accounting for 20% of the MPI, is a total lack of school attendance.
So when we talk about a 72.5% economic freefall, we have to connect it directly to these two human outcomes.
Yes.
This isn't about people downsizing their lifestyles. When nearly half of a nation's poverty is defined mathematically by literal starvation and empty classrooms, we are talking about a society that has lost the capacity to sustain the biological and intellectual future of its own children.
We really need to unpack the underlying mechanisms here, especially regarding malnutrition.
Yeah, please do.
Because malnutrition in early childhood isn't just about a child being hungry today. When a child under the age of 5 does not receive adequate nutrition, their body goes into extreme triage.
Triage, like a hospital emergency room.
Exactly like that. The body prioritizes keeping the heart beating and the lungs breathing, but what it sacrifices is the brain. The brain is starved of the energy it needs to form neural pathways.
So it causes permanent neurological stunting.
Yes, it damages the immune system, limits physical growth, and permanently caps cognitive development. You cannot simply feed a stunted child 5 years later and reverse the damage. The developmental window closes.
God. And then you layer that biological reality right on top of the education data. 20% of the poverty metric is driven by children not being in school.
Right.
So you have an entire generation that is physically and neurologically compromised by a lack of food. And simultaneously, you're locking them out of the educational system.
The sociology of an empty school is profound. I mean, in a developing nation, a school is rarely just a place for academic learning.
Right, so much more than that.
It is a critical node of the social safety net. It's often where children receive their only guaranteed meal of the day. It's where public health initiatives like basic vaccinations are actually administered. When the school system collapses, that entire localized safety net vanishes right along with it.
Which practically guarantees that the crisis will persist for decades. I mean, long after the geopolitical headlines fade, long after any peace treaties might be signed, this dual crisis of malnutrition and lost schooling represents a biological and intellectual scarring that will haunt the country's recovery.
Absolutely.
You have a generation that will enter adulthood physically compromised and totally lacking the basic literacy and technical skills required to rebuild a modern economy.
Which is exactly why the data forces us to look even deeper into how this suffering is distributed.
Right.
Because everything we have analyzed so far, the HDI dropping to 0.470, the GNI evaporating by over 72%, the MPI at 37.4%, these are all national averages.
And averages are inherently deceptive. They smooth out the jagged edges of a crisis. An average suggests a shared burden, right? Implying that everyone in the country is suffering to roughly the same degree. But in a collapsed state, suffering is never democratic.
Never. Averages hide the true victims at the margins. To find them, we have to look at another metric, the IHDI, the Inequality-Adjusted Human Development Index.
Okay, let's explain how the IHDI works compared to the standard HDI we were discussing earlier.
Think of it this way. The standard HDI looks at the average achievements of a country in health, education, and wealth. But the IHDI looks at how those achievements are actually distributed across the population.
Okay.
Imagine a room of 10 people. In one scenario, every single person has 5 units of food. The average is 5.
Right.
In another scenario, one powerful person hoards 50 units of food, and the other 9 people have absolutely 0.
But the statistical average of that room is still 5.
Exactly. The raw HDI sees both rooms as exactly equal.
But the reality of the second room is rampant inequality and mass starvation.
Precisely. So the IHDI acts as a penalty. It basically discounts or lowers the standard HDI score based on the severity of the inequality within the country.
Oh, I see.
If a few elites have access to private doctors, international schools, and hoarded wealth while millions of citizens have nothing, the IHDI exposes that disparity by pulling the national score way down.
So if we apply that to our data, we know Yemen's raw HDI in 2023 was already a catastrophic 0.470. What happens when you apply the inequality penalty?
When you adjust for how unequally health, education, and wealth are actually distributed, that score plummets even further, landing at just 0.325.
0.325, that is a staggering drop.
It really is. The gap between the raw HDI of 0.470 and the adjusted IHDI of 0.325 represents what statisticians call the overall loss due to inequality.
Okay.
In this specific case, it represents a 30.5% loss.
A roughly 30.5% inequality tax levied directly on the most vulnerable people in the country.
That is exactly what it is. And to understand the severity of that tax, we have to look at the global context again. Every country on Earth struggles with inequality to some degree.
Yeah.
Every country sees a drop between their HDI and their IHDI.
Right. Nobody's perfectly equal.
But the global average for this overall loss hovers around 21.9%.
So while the global average loss to inequality is around 22%, Yemen is losing over 30%. This tells us something so crucial about the mechanics of scarcity. When an economy shrinks by 72.5%, human nature and systemic power structures just kick into overdrive.
They absolutely do.
The people at the top of the social hierarchy consolidate their grip on the remaining 27.5% of the wealth.
The hoarding of scarce resources is a universal feature of institutional collapse. Whatever functioning medicine is left, whatever clean water is available, whatever safe shelter exists, it all flows upward to those with the capital or the physical power to command it.
Which means the people at the bottom aren't just suffering from the baseline poverty of the nation. They're being actively crushed by a massively unequal distribution of whatever meager resources are left. The devastation is entirely disproportionate.
And exploring that disproportionate devastation brings us to the most glaring absolute divide in this entire data set.
Yeah.
When we talk about the most marginalized segments absorbing the brunt of the collapse, we are overwhelmingly talking about one specific demographic. We are talking about the total systemic exclusion of women.
The gender data we are about to explore is so extreme it almost breaks the scales used to measure it. We are looking at the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII.
The GII is a composite measure that evaluates gender inequalities in three critical aspects: reproductive health, empowerment, and economic status.
Okay.
It ranges from 0, where women and men fare equally, to 1, where one gender fares as poorly as possible in all measured dimensions.
Out of the 182 countries measured globally on this index, where does Yemen rank?
They rank 182 out of 182.
Dead last, the absolute bottom of the barrel. And it is so crucial to internalize what this means. This isn't a situation where a country is just, slightly behind its regional peers in adopting progressive workplace norms. A ranking of 182 out of 182 is a statistical absolute zero for gender parity. You mathematically cannot rank lower on the planet Earth.
Their actual score on the index is 0.838. To put that in perspective, the global average GII is around 0.455.
Wow.
A score of 0.838 reflects a society where women have been fundamentally erased from the public, political, and economic spheres.
Let's pull out the data on political empowerment to show exactly what the mechanism of that erasure actually looks like. Because erasure isn't just some dramatic metaphor here. It is the literal mathematical description of the data. If we look at the share of seats in Parliament, the halls of power where the laws are drafted, where the scarce remaining resources are allocated, and where the future of the nation is decided, what is the percentage of female representation?
The data reveals that women hold a microscopic 0.299% of parliamentary seats.
0.299%. Which means men hold 99.7% of the power. If we visualize this data, say, as a waffle chart,
Right.
imagine a massive auditorium with 1,000 seats, 1,000 chairs where the entire fate of a nation is being voted on. Out of those 1,000 seats, only 3 of them are occupied by women, 997 men and 3 women.
It is a breathtaking visual of exclusion, but the real insight comes from understanding the policy consequences of that exclusion.
Right.
Why does this specific metric, that 0.299%, matter so deeply to the rest of the country's collapse?
Because if you aren't in the room, your needs don't exist in the legislation.
Precisely. When women are statistically eliminated from the political sphere, their specific survival needs become entirely invisible to the state. If men hold 99.7% of the voting power, legislation regarding maternal health care funding simply does not get prioritized.
Laws protecting female property rights or providing recourse for gender-based violence are just ignored.
Exactly. Educational budgets for girls' schools are the very first to be cut.
It creates a self-reinforcing loop of marginalization. The less political power women have, the worse their health and economic outcomes become. And the poorer and sicker they are, the harder it is for them to ever organize and achieve political power.
So we have to ask, If women are completely locked out of the halls of power, what is happening to them out in the real world? What does their daily economic survival actually look like?
Well, let's examine the labor force participation rates.
Hmm.
This metric looks at the percentage of the population aged 15 and older who are either working or actively looking for formal work. For men in Yemen, the labor force participation rate stands at 65.7%.
So a clear majority of men are still attached to the labor force, even in a collapsed economy.
But for women, the rate is a dismal 5.9%.
5.9%. That means over 94% of adult women are entirely excluded from the formal economy.
Now, if I'm thinking about how an economy functions during a massive crisis, my historical instinct is that extreme scarcity forces everyone to work.
Right.
If we look at global conflicts like World War II, women entered the factories in massive numbers because the men were fighting and households needed dual incomes just to survive wartime inflation. But you're telling me the data here shows the exact opposite.
It does, and understanding the why behind this is critical. In industrialized total war, factories need labor. But in a collapsed state like we are analyzing, the infrastructure itself dies.
Right.
The formal jobs disappear. Work becomes highly informal, manual, and fiercely competitive.
There are no factories for women to enter.
Exactly. And when basic resources become that scarce, patriarchal social structures act as a triage mechanism. Jobs and economic opportunities are aggressively consolidated by men, who are culturally viewed as the primary breadwinners.
Right, that makes sad sense.
Furthermore, you have to consider physical security.
Oh, right. If the institutions have collapsed, the streets aren't safe.
Without a functioning police force, safe public transportation, or secure roadways, the simple act of traveling to a market or a workplace becomes deeply hazardous. Families default to keeping women indoors for their own physical protection.
Wow.
So the economic collapse didn't pull women into the labor market to help households survive. It violently shoved them out. It forced them into complete economic dependence on male relatives precisely at a time of severe national scarcity.
And the income data perfectly mirrors that violent exclusion. If we look at the Gender Development Index, the female gross national income per capita, again, adjusted for purchasing power, is roughly $137 for the entire year.
$137.
While the male GNI per capita is $1,876. Men are earning nearly 14 times more than women. This total loss of financial autonomy is terrifying. If a woman is in an abusive household, or if she needs emergency medical care that requires payment, she has absolutely zero independent financial means to save herself.
Which leads us directly into the biological cost of this marginalization. Economic erasure translates directly into physical vulnerability. We look at the maternal mortality ratio, which measures the number of women who die from pregnancy-related causes per 100,000 live births. In Yemen, that ratio sits at a deeply alarming 183.4 deaths per 100,000 live births.
To add context to that, in highly developed nations, maternal mortality is often in the single digits. To be at 183.4 means that the simple biological act of giving birth is a statistically significant risk to a woman's life.
And you have to combine that maternal mortality rate with the adolescent birth rate.
What's that number?
The data shows 75.3 births per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19.
God, so you have a massive population of very young women, essentially girls, getting pregnant in a system where they have zero political voice to advocate for their needs, zero economic independence to buy medicine, and access to a completely broken healthcare system.
It is a compounding crisis of extreme physical vulnerability.
And the ultimate toll of all these intersecting failures, the evaporating wealth, the severe malnutrition, the collapsed schools, the total gender exclusion, the failing hospitals, it all funnels down into one foundational metric.
Yes, the ultimate measure of human survival.
Life expectancy at birth. Looking at the timeline, the overall life expectancy dropped from 65.5 years in 2014, right before the major structural break, down to 63.7 years in 2021.
It's since slightly crept up to around 64 or 64.9 years in 2023, but it has essentially stagnated.
We really need to recognize how rare a dropping life expectancy is in modern demographics.
It is incredibly rare.
Globally, human beings are constantly living longer. Medical knowledge spreads, sanitation generally improves, and life expectancy slowly ticks upward almost everywhere. When a nation's life expectancy actually drops and then stagnates for an entire decade, it is the ultimate indicator of a society in biological distress. It means the physical environment the population is living in has become fundamentally lethal.
We've covered an immense amount of ground here, unpacking some incredibly heavy statistics.
We really have. I want to take a step back and look at all the puzzle pieces we've laid out. We started with this riddle about a green utopia and a massive drop in carbon emissions, and we have drilled all the way down to a stagnant life expectancy and a 183.4 maternal mortality rate.
Right.
Can we draw the definitive line connecting these dots? How does one factor trigger the next?
When we synthesize this entire 15-part data set, what emerges is not a list of isolated problems. We are looking at a tightly integrated downward spiral.
Okay.
A perfect, devastating causal loop of systemic collapse.
Walk us through the mechanics of that loop. Where does the cycle actually begin?
It begins with the onset of systemic conflict and institutional violence. This triggers the immediate economic collapse, which we saw visualized in the GNI plummeting by 72.5%. The formal economy simply evaporates.
And when the economy evaporates, the state loses its ability to collect tax revenue.
Exactly. Without revenue, the state cannot fund itself. This leads to the total paralysis of public services and infrastructure. The power plants shut down, the factories cease operations, and the supply chains freeze. Now, inadvertently, this massive infrastructural paralysis causes the plunge in the country's material footprint and carbon emissions.
Right. This is the green illusion we started with.
Yes. The PHDI looks mathematically sustainable only because the industrial heart of the country has stopped beating.
The emissions drop because the infrastructure is dead.
Precisely. But what happens next? When public services and infrastructure die, the education and healthcare systems fail. Schools close. Hospitals run out of basic supplies. And as we learned from the inequality data, that 30.5% IHDI penalty, this collapse of services hits the most vulnerable people first and hardest.
The people at the bottom absorb the impact.
Yes. And the most systemically vulnerable demographic in this heavily patriarchal society are women.
Right.
So as extreme scarcity takes hold, society contracts. It pulls resources inward to the elites and the men, and it violently locks women out of the economy and the public sphere entirely.
We see this verified in the 5.9% labor force participation and the 0.299% parliamentary representation. Women are completely erased.
And because women are erased from the political and economic spheres, there is no one advocating for the resources needed to sustain maternal health, childhood nutrition, or female education.
Which leads to the next stage of the loop. The physical vulnerability of the population skyrockets. This manifests in the massive malnutrition rate, that 24.6% of the poverty index, and the rising mortality rates.
And finally, all of these compounding factors, the wealth evaporation, the lost schooling, the dropping life expectancy, the extreme gender inequality, they all feed directly back into the overall Human Development Index,
resulting in that historic regression from 0.502 down to 0.470.
It is a closed circle of devastation. Conflict kills the economy. The dead economy kills the infrastructure. The dead infrastructure isolates the vulnerable.
The isolation of the vulnerable degrades the biological health of the population.
And a biologically degraded, uneducated population ensures the country cannot economically recover, even if the conflict ends.
So looking forward, beyond the daily geopolitical headlines, beyond the calls for ceasefires and diplomatic treaties, what is the fundamental takeaway from this data? Because the numbers prove something very disturbing about the speed of destruction versus the speed of recovery.
The numbers prove definitively that it only takes a few short years to destroy a country's development indices. The structural collapse after 2014 erased over 20 years of hard-fought progress in less than half a decade. But healing those wounds, specifically the biological and intellectual wounds, that takes generations.
It's the difference between rebuilding infrastructure and rebuilding human capital. You can pour concrete and rebuild a bombed-out bridge in a few months. But you cannot unstunt the physical and neurological growth of an entire generation of children who spent their first 5 years severely malnourished. You cannot magically replace the decade of foundational education that millions of children missed while the schools were closed.
If we connect this to the broader philosophy of global aid, it fundamentally changes how we need to view recovery.
How so?
True development and rebuilding cannot just be pallets of food dropped on a tarmac or a temporary cessation of violence. A ceasefire stops the act of bleeding, but it does not cure the underlying disease. Recovery requires a profound restructuring of the society itself.
Based on the mechanics we've unpacked today, what must that restructuring prioritize?
It must prioritize integrating women back into the economic and political spheres. If the gender inequality index remains at an absolute baseline, if women remain restricted to 0.299% of political representation, the specific healthcare and educational needs of half the population will never be addressed.
Mm.
Recovery will be mathematically impossible. Furthermore, it requires a massive, sustained intervention to rescue the generation of uneducated, malnourished children before their developmental windows close permanently.
Right.
The data tells us unequivocally that without these deep structural interventions, the human development black hole will simply continue to fold in on itself, trapping millions in a cycle of multidimensional poverty.
It is a heavy, incredibly sobering reality to process. But looking directly at these numbers, understanding the how and the why behind the statistics, is the only way to truly comprehend the mechanics of societal collapse.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this intense, deeply necessary exploration. True global awareness means looking past the surface-level metrics. It means refusing to be fooled by an isolated data point that seems to tell a happy story, and instead digging into the complex, often painful reality of the human beings living inside those numbers.
The data is a map, but you really have to understand the topography of human suffering to know how to read it correctly.
And I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. Think back to where we started, that striking visual of the green leaf, the illusion of the green utopia. If global indices like the planetary pressures-adjusted HDI can technically classify a collapsed state, a place where wealth has evaporated by 72%, where children are neurologically stunted from starvation, and where life expectancy is dropping as environmentally sustainable. Isn't it time we fundamentally redesign how we measure the progress of human civilization, so that profound human suffering can never again be disguised as a statistical victory?